Hello, I'm Jennifer Flerell, Museum Assistant at the Cedarburg Art Museum. Welcome to a virtual gallery tour of Little Gems, Big Impact, an exhibition of works from the Wisconsin Watercolor Society on display now at the Cedarburg Art Museum. This exhibition has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts and Wisconsin Arts Board. This exuberant exhibition of watercolors currently fills the first floor gallery spaces at the museum, which is located in the historic 1898 Joachim-Wittenberg Mansion in Cedarburg. You can see on your screen views of the exhibition in the museum's galleries. The Wisconsin Watercolor Society is a juried membership organization that exhibits its members' artwork at various venues twice annually to promote the medium of watercolor. We are honored to host this distinguished group of artists. 22 current members and 1 prospective member are showing a total of 60 watercolors in a variety of naturalistic, abstracted, and non-representational styles. Artists with work featured in this exhibition are from all areas of Wisconsin, and the state's varying landscape becomes a frequent source of inspiration. In this gallery tour, we'll take a closer look at one work from each artist represented in the exhibition, learning a bit more about each artist's creative inspiration and process. Artist Christine Alfrey is drawn to flowers, and she tells us, "I've always painted flowers, but last spring, when we all became confined with COVID restrictions, I started painting flowers. I painted every one, and I knew they would make others happy. Flowers always do." Alfrey tells us she does not like to color in the lines or follow the rules with her art. We see some evidence of her intuitive approach in this energetic and vibrant work called Daffodils in Spring. Alfrey presents us with a still life with daffodils in varied and saturated yellows and oranges against a background that explores contrast and varied textures. She incorporates acrylic paint along with her watercolor. The acrylic black and white linear elements add implied movement along with texture and dimensionality. Touchstone by Charles Osowich depicts a landscape in autumn. In a statement from the artist, Osowich tells us, "The more I see, the more I paint. The more I paint, the more I see." His close observations come to life in this landscape painted with a palette that is perfectly suited to an autumn day with its warm yellows and subtle purple hues. Touchstone explores pictorial depth through the darkened background, contrast with the lighter elements, the large stone shapes, and natural elements in the foreground. The repetition of the short horizontal markings on the birch trees on the left side of this work also add a visual texture that contrasts to the verticality of the tall and bare trees, all which creates depth and layers of visual interest. A painting trip to Spain inspired Bridget Austin's White Village, Comares, Spain. She tells us, "I had the pleasure of touring this Andalusian hilltop town and was overwhelmed with the beauty of the place." She says, "What to paint? I could have done 100, I may still." This painting was done at home after the trip, but gave her time to think about how to capture the freshness of the scene in watercolor. Adding ink for some of the details allowed her to keep the transparent washes and not overwork the piece. She simplified the houses stacked on top of each other and framed the composition with foliage in the foreground and middle ground. Her ability to capture the brilliant light and shadows convey the essence of this beautiful spot. Jane Barnard's Inside the Light #1 is an abstract watercolor based on poetic text by Rainer Maria Rilke, Buddha Inside the Light. The first stanza of the text reads, "Center of all centers, core of cores, almond self-enclosed and growing sweet. All this universe, to the furthest stars, all beyond them, is your flesh, your fruit." Barnard's love of poetry and her imagery of the cosmos combine here, showing the luminous transparency of watercolor anchored by a geometry as well as subtle text to give this work its depth. Chuck Bauer from Madison notes that his inspiration is light, specifically light falling on planes in the built environment. Note that in his work Houses on Chadbourne Avenue, he draws the viewer's eye to the home on the right through rich contrasting colors, warm yellows and oranges, contrasted with vibrant and purples and blues, along with a focus on the crisp planes of the building's edges. However, he intentionally chooses to include part of another structure, the house on the left. The space between the two creates a negative space saturated with color that leads the viewer into this quiet scene. Bauer tells us, I am motivated by the challenge to make an interesting visual image from material that may not always be conventionally exciting. For example, backyards and the rear sides of buildings or other structures. Sudden high contrast shifts, exaggerated shadows, etc., tend to help convey light to moving in an exciting way. The watercolor medium offers the spontaneity and the adventure that seem to suit my personal approach. Careful but not too careful, accidental but not too accidental, flexible and elastic, but with some restraint. Judy Beyer muses, what better time is there than autumn to be in Wisconsin? Trees showcase all their bright colors of reds, yellows, oranges, rusts, and greens as the sun shimmers on them. The air has the smell of leaves, plants, and flowers ebbing away. Her favorite bonding with autumn is walking amongst the fallen leaves up to her ankles while listening to them crunch under her feet. She captures this multi-sensory experience in her work, Autumn in Wisconsin. The work focuses on the detail that can be found in a variety of fallen leaves. She has framed the composition with geometric shapes that create a symbolic pathway through the rustling leaves. More linear in approach than the leaf detail are several moth-like creatures that add variety and subtle repetition through the composition. Reflecting on her work, Sylvia Cavagnaro tells us, emerald was created with the alcohol, ink, and watercolor mixed medium. At first sight, this work may appear to be an abstract color study. Indeed, the title Emerald highlights the prevalence of green tones and echoes the little gems themes of the exhibit. On the other hand, there are figurative elements hidden within the color patches and contrasting lines. Cavagnaro goes on to explain, this piece is inspired by the Bible story of Isaac, who shares a tear of joy when he realizes that his father is no longer going to kill him and will sacrifice a lamb instead. In the lower part of the piece, you can see a large open book with a turning page. The middle of the panel features the profile of Isaac with curly black hair and one tear of relief emerging from his eye. This is the focal point of the piece. A blue furry lamb wraps around Isaac's shoulder, suggesting love of life, a quest for help, and maybe fear for an untimely and unfair death. Light beams from the top suggest the presence of the supernatural and a yellow-green stylized angel. One can almost feel and hear the wind as it rustles the plants that emerge from the sand dunes that Bill Davis depicts in his landscape, Dune Fences. The light-colored sand gently arcs to form the dunes, and the soft, painterly touch is in gentle contrast to the slightly more aggressive rendering of the emerging plants and the repetition of the vertical slats of the fences. Davis's work often depicts cityscapes, landscapes, indigenous structures in an impressionistic style, incorporating strong form and value contrast. Ebby Grassi's inspiration for After the Roundup came from a trip to Custer State Park in South Dakota in September. 1,400 buffalo were corralled for medical checks and branding. They were then released back into the park to roam free. She tells us she grew to admire these creatures that look almost prehistoric, creatures so powerful, just roaming the park. Grassi has completed a series of 5 watercolors inspired by this experience, and she has plans for more. In this work, our point of focus becomes a massive buffalo returning our gaze. But being in the presence of this imposing animal does not strike tension, but rather awe. The sunset in the background adds rich color to the work, and we see interesting pops of color throughout as well. Subtle blues and purples in the form of the animal, as well as in the grassy foreground. Jennifer Harrow tells us that her artistic passion is to capture the true likeness and spirit of her chosen subject through the medium of watercolor. In fact, she believes watercolor is the most exciting medium, allowing her to realistically portray her subject matter by building layers of color. Harrow's inspiration often comes from her gardens and the life within them. She enjoys capturing the moths, butterflies, birds, and feathers she finds at her home in Merton, Wisconsin, as she has done here in her watercolor entitled Red Admiral. In this work, our focus is drawn to its namesake, the red admiral butterfly, but after taking in its delicate shape, we soon see the depth Harrow has created all around the work in the very green colors of the leaves in the foreign midground, contrast against the deep blue of the background, with its own complex linear web of branches. Snake Hill is the local name for Ravine Drive, a road that winds uphill from Lincoln Memorial Drive below the bluffs on Milwaukee's east side, crawling uphill into Lake Park, a Frederick Law Olmsted design jewel and the subject of many of Steve Horvath's watercolors. He tells us he enjoys exploring a subject almost to exhaustion to wring out all the possibilities, giving him the opportunity for exploration, experimentation, as this work might suggest. The near imagery in the top of Snake Hill suggests the drop off into a ravine by the change in value from saturated color in the foreground to softer trees and foliage in the background. The deep background shows an illuminated open field in front of another tree line deeper in the painting. The pointillistic approach is Horvath's way of focusing on the strength of the subject matter. Molly Johnson has been working on a new body of work for the past 2 years that depict the changing seasons and months of the year through the lens of her travels. The inspiration for her work entitled Landscape 3 came in autumn during a motorcycle tour with her husband as they took in western Wisconsin. She tells us this work strives to convey the feeling she experienced while taking in the beautiful winding roads, changing colors, and the solitary feeling of being the sole riders for miles. She tells us she hopes the viewer feels the sun on your face and the wind in your hair as you approach this work. In fact, all 3 pieces Johnson has contributed to this exhibition share a theme: the depiction of a road, path, or driveway. In her work, she encourages us to ask ourselves, which path would you take? Gail Giusek sees the world through shapes and shadows, always discovering new patterns and perspectives. This we find to be true in her work Flowing, which at first appears as a non-objective work, but upon closer study, we see that the subject matter is in fact the rippled surface of a body of water, the light dancing on its surface in stark contrast to the shadows. This composition captures the briefest moment in time, and consequently, we feel the sense of energy and movement in her investigation of light, shadow, shape, and color. Giusek tells us that she hopes her work sparks appreciation for the beauty of what lies in the overlooked or unseen. Kerry Coutser paints in the American Impressionist style, painting with limited hues to set a mood to draw the viewer in. In Nature's Glow, Coutser depicts a landscape that appears quintessentially Wisconsin, with full trees asymmetrically framing the composition. The deep green foliage is broken up by the linear depiction of trunks and branches, these similar lines and shapes repeating throughout the composition. Our point of focus becomes the sun rising in the far back, which we see reflected in the near ground. Artist Joy Moon tells us, although my formal training is in realism, I enjoy the challenge that abstraction has to offer. The non-objective paintings are like putting the pieces of a puzzle together, but not having any puzzle pieces to start with. Unlike realism, the end product is an unknown, but delightful when it all comes together. In The Color Red, Moon employs her understanding of color theory to create a variety of colors, variations on the color red in different hues, along with subtle blues, greens, and yellow for contrast. The paint is applied using a variety of techniques, including standard painting with a brush, spraying paint that Moon has mixed up, and taking away color using various methods. Moon also explores surface texture as an important element in her compositions. Barbara Matthews creates a striking composition in Rusty Away. The subject matter here is a bicycle, but by cropping the composition, the bike's gears and parts become less artistically significant than the negative space surrounding the object. The cast shadow Matthews has rendered is an artistically relevant shape that acts as the true subject of the work. Matthews' adept handling of the medium results in a composition that marries both striking realism in the handling of the bike and the metallic bike stand, as well as near abstraction in the flattened shadow on the warm-colored surface of the ground. Head Gasket Job by Michael Pearson was inspired by a mechanic who was doing just that, a gasket replacement on a car. Pearson tells us, I stopped over to discuss an oil change when the mechanic showed me what he was working on. I paint mostly still life, but I'm always on the lookout for something paint-worthy. Some projects catch my eye because of the light colors or a good composition that comes naturally. For this work, the vertical and horizontal lines contrasting with the curved and cylindrical shapes appealed to Pearson. For the sake of inviting asymmetry, he cropped the composition to include 3 cylindrical shapes. The forms are very competently rendered through the use of light and shadowed on their metallic surfaces. Pretty in Pink by Judith Radke is a floral still life. In this composition, our one blooming flower easily becomes the center of attention with its variations on pink against a muted background that is broken to include perhaps a tabletop and wall. Yet when we look beyond the boldness of the striking flower, we find delightful and surprising moments, such as in the depiction of water in the tall and thin vase, and in particular the lovely shapes the artist has created at the water surface. Radke says that her watercolor paintings are inspired by her experience working as a gardener at the Payne Art Center and Gardens in Oshkosh. She tells us, after spending many hot and sunny days inside those garden walls, I became immersed in the quiet beauty found in the tranquil spaces. It's my intention to evoke that same sense of peace and calm. Capy Schwartz says that whenever she visits Door County in Wisconsin, she always crosses the old bridge into Sturgeon Bay to see the tugboats lined up along the close-by dock. Honoring Donald J. Sarter by Schwab pays homage to a tugboat captain from Sturgeon Bay who lost his life on Lake Superior in 2019. She says his passing touched her and inspired this memorable work. Carolyn Simpson describes her works Gourds Galore, saying it was a 2020 challenge painting for the Wauwatosa Artists Workshop. The workshop chose a photo, in this case a beautiful photo of gourds, and we were encouraged to do our rendition of the photo. I chose to pour watercolor paint over Yupo paper in order to get a brilliant color, have a painterly messy and mottled look, and be able to remove paint easily in areas that I wanted a different color. My attempt was to show an explosion of rich fall color in the familiar shape of gourds. Alice Strzek shows us a scene from downtown Milwaukee, Wisconsin in her work entitled Market Street. There are a couple things to note about Strzek's work. First, this work is one of only a few in this exhibition that incorporate human figures in the composition. Here we see a lively scene where interactions between the figures become the central focus against a background of architectural forms, including the dramatic wedge shape of the building awning in the center of the composition. In terms of her presentation, Wedge does not include a mat or glass in the presentation of her final work, as is typical with works on paper. Rather, she varnishes the watercolor with a fine art varnish and then waxes the surface. This serves to protect the artwork, but also creates a unique and interesting surface. Catherine Wedge says, I am always energized and amazed at what can be created from a blank piece of paper or canvas. The process, the transformation from idea to art, that's what I love. Although Wedge uses a variety of art media, she concentrates on water media, specifically watercolor and acrylic. Her paintings explore the theme of nature, architecture, and the human form. She enjoys using paint to express the abstract forms found in representational images, and this becomes evident in Sun Sisters, in which we see 2 sunflowers against a painterly green background. Though the subject matter, the sunflowers, is apparent in this work, we can see her interest in simplifying these forms to their most interesting shapes and then finding moments to repeat those interesting shapes in an abstracted and painterly background. Wedge describes her inspiration, saying, "Subject matter becomes the framework within which I play with value, shape, and color." Thank you for joining us on our gallery tour of Little Gem's Big Impact Wisconsin Watercolor Society. There is much more work in a variety of subject matter and styles to see at the museum. For those who are able, we invite you to visit the Cedarburg Art Museum to experience these works and many others in person. And for those interested, many of these works are also for sale while on display. You can also find biographical and other information about the artists online at the Wisconsin Watercolor Society website. For those who are able, we look forward to welcoming you to the Cedarburg Art Museum. Visit cedarburgartmuseum.org for museum hours, along with more information about our COVID precautions. If you would like to see more exhibitions like Little Gem's Big Impact, consider a membership to the Cedarburg Art Museum. You can find more information online. Our thanks to the talented artists of the Wisconsin Watercolor Society for sharing your impressive work with us. Thanks to all who have joined us on this virtual gallery tour at the Cedarburg Art Museum.